In December of 1976, a film crew working on a television production at an amusement park in Long Beach, California, reached out to reposition what they assumed was a wax mannequin hanging in the haunted house. When the arm broke off, it didn't snap the way wax snaps. It revealed muscle. It revealed bone. The mannequin had been a real human being for 65 years, and nobody had noticed. That man was Elmer McCurdy, and his story is where this one begins. We talk about the Wild West like we know it. We've seen the films, the TV shows, the romanticized paintings of sunsets over wagon trains, and lone graves marked with a single wooden cross. But what actually happened to the dead out there? The mechanics of it, the economics of it, the sheer desperate human reality of it, has been smoothed over into something clean and cinematic that bears almost no resemblance to the truth. What you are about to learn is darker than that, more human than that. In some ways more honorable than anything Hollywood ever invented. You'll hear about the mothers on the Oregon Trail who buried their children in the middle of the road and then drove every wagon over the grave. You'll learn about the government order that sent soldiers to cut the heads off the freshly dead. And you'll find out about the town in Nevada where 72 people were buried before a single person died of natural causes. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, at the end. In the mid-1800s, the average life expectancy in America was 37 years. 37. That number isn't a typo and it isn't an abstraction. It means that death was not a distant event that happened to old people in hospitals. It happened in your house. It happened to your children. It happened to you often before you had a chance to see what your life might have amounted to. On the frontier especially, death arrived without ceremony and demanded to be dealt with by whoever was standing closest. In the early part of the century, that person was almost always a woman. The management of the dead, the washing of the body, the wrapping, the dressing, fell to the women of the household as a matter of course. There was no industry for it yet. There were no professionals. A local carpenter, if you had one nearby, would build you a coffin from pine boards. If you didn't have a carpenter, you built it yourself. The body lay in the home parlor, which is where the word funeral parlor would eventually come from. The smell of beeswax candles, of dried lavender pressed into the linens, of the body itself in warm weather. That was the smell of death in 1840s America. Intimate, unavoidable, and borne by the family entirely. A basic pine coffin cost between $2 and $5. For most frontier families, that was manageable, barely. But by the 1840s, something new had arrived in the market. The Fisk metallic burial case. Cast iron, airtight, shaped to the human form like a mold. It could preserve a body for transport across hundreds of miles, for delayed burial when the ground was frozen, for the kind of send-off that said your family had resources. It cost up to $100. That was, for a working man of the era, the better part of several months' wages. The gap between what a poor family could afford and what a prosperous one could afford was not subtle. It was the difference between a pine box and something closer to a monument. The Civil War changed everything. When thousands of soldiers began dying hundreds of miles from home and their families wanted them back, a new industry was born almost overnight. Dr. Thomas Holmes, sometimes called the father of modern American embalming, preserved bodies on the battlefield using chemical arterial injection, charging up to $100 per body. The federal government issued General Order 39 to regulate these men, creating the first formal licensing structure for undertakers. And then Abraham Lincoln died in April of 1865, and his body was embalmed so effectively that it remained lifelike through a 2-week funeral procession across the country. After that, the trade was no longer optional. It was expected. By the 1870s and 1880s, a lined and hinged casket ran between $20 and $30. An adult burial plot in a formal cemetery could cost anywhere from $40 to $400, depending on how recently that cemetery had decided to call itself a park. A marble headstone added another $20 to $50. For a middle-class family, the total cost of a proper burial ranged from $50 to $100, a sum that could break a household budget entirely. And that was if you made it to a town with an undertaker. Most people on the frontier didn't. Here is something that gets left out of most conversations about this era, and it matters. The western frontier was not a place where people were tough enough to handle death without feeling it. The graves along the Oregon Trail, and there were thousands of them, so many that the trail was sometimes called a 2,000-mile cemetery, were not just logistical problems. They were catastrophes of the heart. Diaries from 1852 describe emigrants leaving fresh graves in the unpeopled wilderness, knowing that no one would tend them, knowing that the marker they drove into the ground would be knocked over by the next wagon through. Esther McMillan Hanna wrote of the heartbreak of leaving the dead deserted in the land they had crossed half a continent to reach. We have inherited a version of frontier history that confuses practicality with hardness. The people who buried their dead in wagon ruts and drove over them, they were not hard. They were heartbroken people doing the only thing available to them. There is a difference. And if you've ever had to do something difficult because it was the only option and done it anyway, you know exactly what that feels like. This part of Western history isn't just about graves. It's about what people do when love has no good options left. That is the ground this story is built on. Between 1841 and 1869, somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 people walked the Oregon Trail. Conservative estimates say 1 in 10 of them died before they arrived. 1 in 10. That's not a rounding error. That's a mass casualty event spread out over 2,000 miles of prairie, mountain, and desert. The killers were not, as the movies suggest, primarily violence. They were cholera, tuberculosis, accidental deaths from wagon wheels. On a trail where a single shovel cost $1.50 and potatoes ran 50 cents a pound, prices immigrants in their diaries called outrageous swindles. A proper burial was a luxury that couldn't always be arranged. Wood for coffins was often simply not available. Bodies were wrapped in blankets, in whatever cloth could be spared, and lowered into the earth. Then came the wolves. Prairie wolves could smell a burial from a distance that made any shallow grave an invitation. So a practice emerged that, once you understand it, is one of the most human things these people ever did. They dug the grave directly in the path of the trail. They interred the body, leveled the earth, and then drove the entire wagon train, sometimes 70 wagons, each one weighing close to 2,000 pounds, directly over the grave. The soil was packed so densely that no animal could dig through it. The grave was invisible. The person was protected, even in death, by the sheer weight of the community that had traveled with them. There was no monument. There was often no marker at all, but there was that. Deadwood, South Dakota offers a different kind of burial story. Wild Bill Hickok, lawman, scout, gambler, and by 1876 one of the most famous men in the West, was shot in the back of the head on August 2nd of that year while playing cards. He was holding aces and eights. The hand has been called the dead man's hand ever since, though some historians note that the specific cards weren't documented until well after the fact, suggesting the detail may have been polished by legend rather than recorded in the moment. Hickok was buried first in Ingleside Cemetery, on lower ground that eventually became residential property. In 1879, his body was moved, dug up, and reinterred at Mount Moriah Cemetery, perched on a steep hill overlooking the gulch where gold was first found. Mount Moriah became one of those rare places where the mythology of the West and the actual geography of the West align perfectly. The grave looks out over what Deadwood was, which is exactly what a grave like that should do. Today it remains one of the most visited sites in the Black Hills, drawing people who want to stand near something real in a landscape full of reconstruction. There is something important to say here about who gets to control a story and who gets remembered and how. The history of frontier burials was not written by everyone who was buried. Much of what we know about this era was written by the people who survived it, and many of those people had every reason to shape the record in their favor. Nowhere is this more visible than in what was done to Native American burial grounds during this same period. Plains tribes practiced scaffold burial. A body was placed on a platform 7 to 10 feet above the ground, exposed to sky and wind, surrounded by the weapons of the deceased and sometimes the body of their horse. The design was not primitive, it was intentional. The scaffold kept the body safe from ground predators. It allowed the physical form to return to the elements gradually, deliberately, while the soul completed its journey. These were not abandoned bodies. These were the most carefully placed people in the landscape. In 1867, the U.S. Surgeon General issued Circular No. 2, a directive to Army medical officers across the frontier ordering the systematic collection of Native American crania for the Army Medical Museum. Military surgeons decapitated the dead on battlefields. They exhumed recent graves. The curator of the museum, George Otis, used these remains explicitly to support theories of racial hierarchy, to argue, on the basis of skull measurements, that Native people were inherently inferior. It is worth saying plainly, this was state-sponsored grave robbery dressed up as science. And it worked for over a century, until NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was finally passed in 1990 and mandated the return of remains held by federal agencies. The repatriation process is still ongoing. The contrast between how the government treated the graves of settlers and how it treated the graves of Native people tells you more about the politics of that era than almost any other single fact. One set of graves was protected, the other was harvested. While all of this was unfolding in the West, the Northeast had its own crisis of burial, one born not of violence or government policy, but of pure, terrible medical ignorance. Tuberculosis, called consumption in the 1800s, was destroying families across New England. It arrived slowly. It took one family member, then another, then another. It caused the body to waste visibly, as though something was literally draining the life away. Without any understanding of bacteria or contagion, families watching their children die one by one reached the only conclusion available to them. The first person to go was feeding on the living from the grave. And so they dug. Bodies were exhumed and examined. If the heart or liver contained what appeared to be liquid blood, a common result of slow decomposition in cold New England soil, the organs were removed and burned. In Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892, a farmer named George Brown dug up his daughter Mercy. Her heart was burned. The ashes were mixed with water and given to her dying brother Edwin to drink as a cure. Edwin died 2 months later. In Connecticut, a skeleton now known only as JB-55 was found with the skull removed from the neck and placed on the chest, and the femur bones crossed in an X below it, the universal skull and crossbones symbol of death deliberately arranged to prevent what the family believed could rise and walk. The burial would have looked, to anyone who opened it, like a deliberate act of desecration. It was, in fact, a desperate act of love. This is the thing about history that keeps pulling me back to it. People doing terrible things because they didn't know any better. People doing terrible things because they were trying to save someone they loved. The line between those two is not always as clear as we'd like it to be. I went back to the McCurdy story after I finished researching all of this, and I sat with it for a while in a way I hadn't expected to. Elmer McCurdy was not a great outlaw. He was not a great anything by most accounts. He was a man from Maine who worked as a plumber and a miner, who discovered late in life that he had been born illegitimate and never quite recovered from it. He took up robbery and he was genuinely bad at it. He routinely used too much explosive and blew up the money he was trying to steal. He was killed in a shootout in Oklahoma in 1911, and no one claimed his body. The undertaker, Joseph Johnson, embalmed him using an arsenic-heavy fluid so concentrated that it mummified the tissue completely. And then, because no one came, Johnson started charging a nickel to see the body, A nickel, the same price as a shot of cheap whiskey in Deadwood. McCurdy went from Johnson's funeral parlor to a traveling carnival, from the carnival to a museum of crime, from the museum to the lobby of an exploitation film, and eventually to a haunted house attraction called The Pike in Long Beach, where he hung in the dark for years until a television crew broke his arm and discovered he was real. He was buried in 1977, 66 years after his death, in Guthrie, Oklahoma, under 2 feet of concrete to prevent anyone from ever moving him again. Here's what I keep thinking about. Elmer McCurdy spent more of his existence as an object than as a person. He achieved more fame after death than he ever managed while living. And the only reason any of that was possible was that no one, for 66 years, thought he deserved the basic human dignity of being put in the ground and left there. The frontier was full of people like that. People who died unmemorialized, unrecorded, buried in wagon ruts or shallow desert graves, or on scaffolds that were torn down by strangers. The graves we know about are the exception. The graves we don't know about are everywhere. This week, if you can, find one photograph from the frontier era. It doesn't have to be famous. It doesn't have to be from a museum. Just an old photo of a place, a face, a stretch of trail. And before you move past it, give that person a moment. Not pity, just presence. The acknowledgement that they were here, that the land required something of them that most of us will never be asked to give, and that they gave it anyway. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family make the journey west? What did they leave behind, and what stories came with them? I want to know. Those answers matter more than most people think. Because here is what all of this comes back to. Underneath the arsenic embalming and the wagon wheel burials and the burning hearts and the government directives, the frontier demanded that ordinary people face mortality directly, without insulation, without professionals to manage it at a distance. They faced it in their homes, on their trails, in the frozen ground of New England winters and the rocky desert soil of Nevada. They didn't always face it well. Sometimes they faced it in ways that haunt us still. But they faced it. We are, in some real sense, the people they were trying to get to. The graves they dug and the bodies they buried were their investment in a future they couldn't see. Every choice they made in the presence of death was a choice made on our behalf. The least we can do is remember that they made it,